Hi everybody, this is Marie from the Counseling Center, and today we're going to spend about 15 minutes talking a little bit about stress. What is stress all about? Where does it come from and how do we manage it? What I thought we would do is we would talk about how our body responds to stress, because that element of self-awareness can be the first step in helping us figure out what it is to do about it. So we're going to start by talking about a cycle, right? The first thing I'd like to mention is that we all walk around with our own set of vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are a combination of a variety of different things having to do with our biology, including genetics and epigenetics, what it is we experienced in the past, has to do with our current level of stress, and also has to do with our self-care. So my vulnerabilities look very different from your vulnerabilities, so we would respond to events in very different ways. So we're all walking around life with our own set of vulnerabilities, and all of a sudden something happens. Some people like to call it a cue or a trigger, but the event is something that starts a cascade of events both in our head and in our body, and that is when we start to experience what you would consider an emotion, right? So we have our own set of vulnerabilities, the cue happens, and depending on what our vulnerabilities are, we all have very different interpretations of that event. Right, so how I would interpret something happening would be very different from how you might interpret something happening. These interpretations then lead to a series of thoughts. So thoughts are incredibly powerful, and they have a very big role when it comes to experiencing the emotions. Every thought that we experience actually releases a set of hormones, some pretty significant hormones, including cortisol, into our body for about 14 seconds. That's right. For every thought we have, our body releases 14 seconds of fight or flight hormones into our body. And that causes a series of very specific physiological changes that actually add up to how we experience an emotion. In those physiological changes are things like our heart rate, our blood pressure, our metabolism, our pupil size, our body temperature. I'm sure people have experienced shifts in body temperature when they have different emotions. If I were to look at someone who had just started to have this sort of like flood of hormones, I would notice things automatically, like their facial expression might change, their posture might change, and their tone of voice might also change. All of these things happen automatically, and the more hormones that get released by the more thoughts that we experience, the more intense we usually experience this part of the emotion, and it can feel very, very uncomfortable. So after we experience those physical changes, it leads to something called an action urge. So this is where we actually have biologically are set up to experience wanting to have an action in response to an emotion. So for example, when we experience fear, we are biologically set up to want to run away. This is very, very protective. So if we were to see a tiger coming through the woods, we would want to bust a move. We would want to get out of there as quickly as possible. We don't even have to think it. Our body will just automatically do it. The action urge for anger is a little bit different. So the action urge for anger actually is attack. So if we experience a really intense emotion, or not even so intense emotion, to anger, we then automatically want to do something in return. And this can take several forms. It can be an actual physical attack. It could be a verbal attack. It could be passive, sort of like silent treatment, slamming the door, sort of befriending somebody, or it could even be sarcasm. And that's another form of attack, right? And these are things that are sometimes really, really hard to stop because we're biologically set up to want to respond to that anger emotion. When we experience sadness, usually what ends up happening, or depression, we have a biological action urge to isolate, to kind of stay inside. The body interprets an emotional insult the same way as it would a physical injury. So usually when you're physically hurt or you're sick, your body wants to sort of shut you down, you snuggle into bed, and you get ready to heal. And the same thing happens when we actually are experiencing an emotional pain. Our body wants us to sort of shut down and to heal and to get ready to get back on out there. So this causes us often to lose motivation and to want to stay isolated away from our friends and family. The last one is shame or guilt. Whenever we experience something similar to that, usually our biological action urge is to hide. And this comes from the period of time when we all traveled in tribes, and it was our responsibility to sort of contribute to the tribe in our own personal ways. If we did something that might hurt the tribe, we were at risk to then being kicked out of the tribe. And that could have been very, very dangerous, including death. So most of us aren't really willing to put on out there what it is we're doing wrong because of how these biological action urges started. So this is kind of like a picture, and I kind of think you might be seeing this backwards, but this is sort of a picture of in summary, of what we just talked about. All right, so we are all walking around with our own set of vulnerabilities. Then we experience a cue or trigger, which leads to an interpretation of that event. That interpretation then in turns leads to a series of thoughts that release hormones into our system, causing physiological changes. Those physiological changes could actually be like heart changes, temperature changes, facial changes. And a lot of times those feel very, very uncomfortable. When we feel those uncomfortable changes, that leads us to experience an action urge, wanting to take action in response to what it is we are experiencing. A lot of times, if our emotions get too intense, we will do something, pretty much anything, to get rid of that emotion. And that's where our action urges come in, right? So that's kind of what happens when we start to experience an emotion in response to stress, which a lot of times motivates us to do some things, right? So what we'd like to talk about in the second part of this little workshop, or whatever it is that we're doing today, is a way to sort of increase self-awareness around what your cycle looks like. And one of the best ways to do that is with a process called mindfulness. Mindfulness is sort of all the buzz. There's been a tremendous amount of research about it, and a lot of people are incorporating it on a daily basis because of all of its benefits. It is a practice of focusing on the present and doing one thing at a time. It is incredibly helpful at allowing our brain to heal from stress, and also to recognize what it is we're experiencing when we are experiencing stress. So I'm going to talk for one or two more minutes about what mindfulness is and how you can start a practice of this on your own now that you've got some time while we're all under quarantine. Right? So mindfulness has a lot to do, and I might actually draw a picture here with attention. So a lot of times people misinterpret mindfulness similar to meditation or relaxation, and they think of it almost as a zone out. But actually mindfulness is more of a focus in. So it's an intense focus of your intention versus sort of a zoning out and not paying attention to anything. And it is really restorative because this is how our brain was intended to work before iPhones, before things became so busy, before we became multitasking perfectionists. Our brain was sort of created to work more along the lines of in a simpler way, doing one thing at a time and focusing on the here and now. A lot of what causes us distress is the focus on what has happened in the past, or worrying about what's going to happen in the future. And taking our recent events about this coronavirus, there's so many unpredictable components to that, worrying about what is going to happen, that it causes a lot of distress in the moment, even though those negative things haven't necessarily happened quite yet, right? So when we practice mindfulness, we are trying to get our brain to kind of get to a place where I like to call it the wise mind. A wise mind is where we're taking a little bit of our emotional mind and a little bit of our reasonable mind and rational mind and combining it to a place where we are thinking incredibly clearly, right? So I'm going to talk to you a little about how we're going to go about doing that, right? So there's a really simple way to kind of practice creating these new neural pathways with this practice of mindfulness. The first step you're going to want to do is something called observe, where you're going to basically set aside 2 to 5 minutes to just notice what's happening in the present moment. So if we were to pick up on what's happening in all of our senses, right, what we see, what we smell, what we taste, what we touch. Oh, I think I missed one in there, but you get the hang of it, right? So you're going to be noticing what's happening on the ceiling, and you're going to be noticing the fur underneath. Like I have fur in my chair right now. I'm feeling my fur. I'm smelling the rain outside the window. All right, I'm tasting the coffee that I just drank. So you're going to be noticing in the here and now what it is you're experiencing in your 5 senses. and you're going to be saying those things out loud. So the trick is that sometimes it's really hard to get our brain to do what we want it to do, right? But when we say something out loud, it actually forces our brain to focus on what it is we're saying. So it's a really easy trick to kind of get yourself to focus on what it is you'd like your brain to focus on. So you're going to start off by describing what it is you're experiencing with your 5 senses, and then you're going to go into describing what is happening with your thoughts. Now, this is a tricky one, right? So sometimes it's really hard to think about how do you observe and describe your thoughts when you're thinking them. And you want to almost do this in a detached way, kind of like you're separate from your thoughts. A trick that I use is a long time ago. When I was young, I'd watched the Sesame Street episode, and they were teaching letters, and they were teaching uppercase and lowercase letters. And what they ended up doing is they showed a picture of a conveyor belt, and they would drop a letter, for example, an uppercase A, onto the conveyor belt. It would go off the conveyor belt, it would fall off. And then it would drop a lowercase letter and it'd go onto the conveyor belt and fall off. And I think this is a really great way for us to think about how to observe and describe our thoughts. Is imagining our thoughts as full sentences and what they would look like if we were standing a little distant from them. And our full sentences would then drop on a conveyor belt and then fall off the end. We're not trying to stop the thoughts. We're not trying to shift the thoughts. We're not trying to change the thoughts. We're literally just letting the thoughts happen and then watching them fall off the conveyor belt. The last thing that you'd want to, or let's see, I think there's actually 2 more. So another would be observing and describing your emotions. So what it is you're experiencing. Are you experiencing sadness, fear, boredom, loneliness? They're varied things, but this is kind of just a check-in around like, what is it that I'm actually feeling, right? Right here in the here and now. And the last thing would be body sensations. What are you experiencing in your body? Do you have a headache? Are you feeling hungry? Are you feeling sore from a workout yesterday? And so that kind of summarizes what you would need to do. All right. So let's go through and talk a little bit more about how this would be put into practice, right? So you would start off by picking 2 to 5 minutes out of the day. My best time, the time that I like to utilize most is early morning. So right before I get out of bed, I set my alarm for 2 to 5 minutes before I want to actually wake up. And I lay there for a little bit longer and I notice what's happening. I look around, I notice on the ceiling, I notice my bed sheets, I notice what's going on in my bedroom, any sort of smells, and I describe them out loud. Then I go to describing my thoughts as if they're dropping on a conveyor belt and falling off the conveyor belt. And I move to my emotions, what I'm experiencing emotionally, and then to my body sensations. And that's all you do. You observe those 8 things and say them out loud, and that's the end of your mindfulness practice, right? So what's really awesome about mindfulness is that it's creating new neural pathways to make us more resilient to stress, and it's allowing our brain to function in the way that it was intended in the here and now and present, and allows us to increase our levels of self-awareness to notice what I'm experiencing and where is my stress level. And in upcoming videos, which I'm going to be doing today as well, and hopefully you'll be watching the entire series, we're going to talk about preventative ways to kind of prevent, or I would say increase resilience to stressors. And then we're going to also talk about reactive ways of once you're already stressed, how you're going to manage and what you're going to do, what that toolbox looks like. And then finally, we're going to talk about sort of loneliness, right? We're under really special circumstances now that we're all under quarantine. What can we do to help manage loneliness, and learning some skills that can be helpful in the future once quarantine is over as well. Well, it was really nice seeing everybody today. Once again, my name is Maria. I'm from the Counseling Center, and look out for my other 3 videos. Thank you.